Good morning. Um, Good morning. I'm so glad to see you here. When I pulled up into the parking lot today, I went, there's not many places to park here because of the setting half of the lot aside for your homecoming. So I'm glad to hear that the homecoming is happening, but we may have some people walking in late because the parking is a little bit different today. And so thank you for being here. Last week, we talked about Isaiah, which is very dense if you try and read the book, which I've actually been trying to do, is to read the books and the histories. And Isaiah is very dense. And then today we get to Jeremiah, who is even more dense. If you've read the book Jeremiah in the Bible lately, you will understand why his nickname is the Weeping Prophet. Jeremiah is intense, and a lot of his emotions are very intense. And what we will learn today, hopefully, is the intense emotions are not only the anguish that he feels for the people of Judah, but also the great joy that he feels for the people of Judah. He has his highs and he has his lows. So even though he is known as the weeping prophet, um, I have a little surprise at the end that I'm going to bring out to hopefully change his rep, because I think he is far more positive than we give him credit for being. When you start out at the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, it says, "These are the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin." The town he grew up in was a town that was populated by priests, apparently. If you were a priest and you wanted to live just outside of Jerusalem, but close enough to have an easy commute, you moved to Anathoth. And so there were a lot of priests who lived there. And so the fact that Jeremiah was from there and from a family of priests is not unusual. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Amon, king of Judah, and through the reign of I'm saying these all wrong. Let me look and see what I wrote down. Jehoiakim, there we go. Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah. So Jeremiah served 3 different kings. One of them was a really good king. 2 of them were very difficult. Well, one of them particularly. No, 2 were very difficult. And then the 4th, because there was a 4th that they don't mention here, was not quite as bad as the 2 really difficult ones. And then it gets right to the call of Jeremiah. And this is interesting because it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying," this is all written in the first person now, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." So before Jeremiah was even born to his mother, God said, "This one I'm going to make a prophet." That's what we are told here. The Midrash, there are various Midrashes. I think you're supposed to say Midrashim or something, but whatever the plural of Midrash is, there are various ones written in rabbinical tradition about the birth of Jeremiah. And he was so preordained, we are told, to his life of prophecy that he was born circumcised. Now, he's not the only man in the Bible. We are told that Adam was created circumcised, that Moses was born circumcised, and Job was born circumcised, and several others. King David, born circumcised. Why this was a deal, I don't know, but apparently in the Midrash, the rabbinic wisdom that is passed on, it's like Joan Rivers saying, and how Jewish was he? He was born circumcised. And you go, oh, okay, he's the real deal. This guy is very Jewish and very preordained to the life that he will serve in the lives of his people. The other thing that we are told is that he was born a prophet, that he came out of the womb condemning the ill deeds of his mother. Well, now who would know than the baby, in the womb, what his mother had been up to. But in the rabbinical wisdom, we are told that when he said these things about his mother, he was not talking about his earthly mother. He was talking about his mother, the nation of Judah. And you go, well, that's a quick save. Okay, good job. So that is how preordained this guy was. Now, when he was, we are told, 8 or 9, he said, "Ah, sovereign Lord," I said, "I do not know how to speak. I am only a child." But the Lord said to me, "Do not say, 'I am only a child.' You must go to everyone I send you to say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord." Now, this is often read in youth groups. I remember it was read to me when I was in youth group. And when we say, I can't do anything as a Christian to convince other people of the way they should be living their lives, we hear God's word saying, don't use that as an excuse. Don't tell me you're only a child. I am going to find ways to use you. And we are reminded of the stories of David, who only as a child killed a bear and I think a lion, and then ultimately Goliath when he was still a child. And other men in the Bible who as children were used by God in various ways. So the way in which God used Jeremiah, we are told, is that he was sent to a teacher to become literate, which was unusual for the people of his time. And he was sent to Shaphan, 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 who was a scribe in the royal court. And he was sent to him at 12 or 13 so that he could learn to read and write and be literate. Now, this is not in the Bible, but Shaphan is in the Bible very much, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But the rabbinic wisdom through the various midrashes say this is what happened to Jeremiah, and God did as he promised, and he prepared him for what he wanted him to do, so that by the time Jeremiah was 19 or 20, he was ready to go out into the world and prophesy. Then the Lord reached out his hand, Jeremiah says, and touched my mouth and said to me, "Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations, plural, and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, and to build and to plant." So he has 3 things that he is called upon to do. The first one is to uproot and tear down, then to destroy and overthrow all these negatives. And this 19-year-old, 20-year-old's being sent out to approach kings and kingdoms and saying, I'm going to tear you apart. I'm going to uproot your power base. And then after all that, I am going to build and to plant. And we're told that this is important because the people of Judah had become so distanced, and this is a prophetic message we hear over and over again, certainly heard it in Isaiah, so distanced from their covenant with God, with Yahweh, that they are almost unreconcilable. The image that is put forward elsewhere in the book of Jeremiah is like a husband and wife who have been married for a long time, and then they have that conversation where they go, remember how we used to be in love with each other? Remember how we used to be happy? What has happened to us to pull us apart? And there aren't a lot of answers given to that question, but we are reminded that it's been 500 years since Moses. 500 years since the first covenant. So it's been a long time for this marriage of Yahweh and his people, that they have that tough conversation and say, so what are we going to do now to bring us back together? And what it says here is we're going to tear things apart before we're able to build and to plant. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. And the Lord said to me, you have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. Well, what the heck does this mean? What we're told is that the almond tree is a perfect example of a tree where you can see every process take place in due course, and none of the processes fall out of line and precede the other. So the almond tree branch is absolutely bare, and then there are buds, and then there are leaves, and then there are flowers, and then eventually the nut in the almond tree comes into being. So what God is saying is, this is going to take time, and it did take time. We are told that for his first 27 years, he had a 40-year ministry. For his first 27 years, Jeremiah was getting no respect. Nobody was listening to him. He was out there saying, we have distanced ourselves from God. He's the weeping prophet, don't forget. These are the terrible things we have done. These are the terrible things that are going to happen to us. He prophesied so much about the coming of the Babylonian exile, which we hear about right now. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see now? You've seen the almond branch. And we understand what that means is that things are going to happen in stages. So now what do you see? I see a boiling pot tilting away from the north, northern Israel, pointing towards the south. The Lord said to me, from the north, disaster will be poured out on all who live in this land. I am about to summon all the people of the northern kingdoms, declared the Lord. Their kings will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. And what he's predicting is that the Babylonian Empire to the north is going to come and take over everything. I will pronounce my judgments on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshiping what their hands have made. Get yourself ready. Stand up and say to them, whatever I command you, do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Now, what Jeremiah says when he says, I am young, he says two things that he's scared of. Let me find it. Well, anyway, he says, I'm young, they're not going to believe me, they're not going to respect me. And then he says, and I'm going to have to see those faces. I'm going to have to see their faces when they utter disbelief, when they but put forward their feelings of disbelief, of not wanting to hear what I have to say. I'm going to have to see their faces. Now, anybody who has ever been on stage as an actor, or who's ever taught Sunday school class, or has ever done anything, knows exactly what they're talking about. And it's not the faces where people are getting tired. When you're talking about the prophets in particular, the thing that I get so afraid of is the yawns. The people are going, oh, this is a tedious story. Please get on with it. Tell me something fun. It's not just that. It's the faces that you see, and I see them very seldomly in here, and that's God's truth, where people look at you like, wait a minute. That is ridiculous. And you can read it. And when you're acting on stage, particularly if you're acting for children and you're doing plays, kids will just, not only their faces, but they will yell things out. As most of you know, I've had a whole career in theater for children. And some of our favorite stories are when kids get utterly disgusted with what is being presented to them on stage. One of my favorite examples, just because it cracks me up every time I think of it, is it was a scene in our production of the Brer Rabbit folk tales, where the field mouse is getting very flirtatious with Brer Rabbit. And she is going, oh, Brer Rabbit, you're just so sweet and you're cool and you're good looking and you're all that. And Brer Rabbit's getting very nervous. And then a kid in the audience went, hit her with a shovel. Now you sit there, you go, what? So when Jeremiah, when I'm reading this, he says, I'm going to have to look at their faces. I imagine that kid going, hit her with a shovel. And then I was on stage at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis playing a tree that was trying to help the little red hen cross the river so that she could get help to bake the bread. You have to expand on these simple stories. And so we had this tree that was trying to help. And the tree, this was an audience participation thing where we turned to the audience and asked them. And the tree would always say, well, what can I do to help? And they would always say, bend across the creek. And, the little red hen can walk across you. And one day in Indianapolis, a kid went, get a chainsaw. And, so as the actor portraying the tree, you go, okay, those are the faces that Jeremiah is talking about. Faces that say, I'm not falling for any of this, But God says, don't worry, I am going to prepare you to face all of that. So we are told that for 23 years of his 43-year ministry, Jeremiah is walking around and getting no respect from anybody. And then he only has 17 years left, and I couldn't find how these divided up. But the second and third periods, he's with, how do I say it? Joachim, and then Joachim, who were father-son kings. And they didn't listen to Jeremiah at all. And then finally, his final years, he is with Zedekiah. During Joachim, I think I'm saying that right. Yes, Joachim. Jeremiah delivers his temple sermon, which is about the need for ethical reform. The way we have all of this record, we are told, is that Jeremiah wrote it down. He didn't write it down by himself. He had his scribe, his assistant, Baruch. And it's really fascinating to read in here about how he got sent to one scribe to learn how to be literate. Then he works in partnership with another scribe, and I mean really in partnership, because 3 times the scrolls that the scribe wrote down were presented to the king, ripped up and burned. And the kings just went, yeah, I don't want to hear it. So negative response to his positive ministry is coming forward multiple times, but he goes back to Baruch and he said, here's another scroll. They're made on lambskin, and it's parchment, best you can get, write it down, only to have the kings hear it, go, yeah, don't like it, rip it up, and throw it away. So he delivers the temple sermon, and it doesn't focus just on placing other gods before me, which tends to be the standard Old Testament message. When Yahweh gets angry, he says, I'm angry because you're worshiping these other gods and not me. And we hear that over and over and over and over. In the temple sermon, what Jeremiah does is he said, and here's a proof of that. And he talks about the ethical treatment of all peoples and how important it is that we show our covenant with God by restoring the ethical treatment of widows and foreigners and people who are weaker than we are. And one of the things about Jeremiah we are told to pay attention to is that he stresses how important ethical behavior is and not just worship. And this is an expansion over things that have come forward previously. After the temple sermon, Jeremiah is arrested. He is tried, put on trial. He is acquitted, but he is forbidden to preach in the temple ever again. And the king rips up his stuff, burns it. So he goes back to Baruch and he says, all right, let's start all over again. So Baruch writes down another scroll where everything that God has said to Jeremiah, make sure to tell this to the people, gets recorded again. And then he sends Baruch into the temple and says, you read it this time because I'm no longer allowed in there. So King Jehoiakim, once again, takes the scroll, cuts it up, and burns it. Jeremiah and Baruch go into hiding. They go, this is not boding well. He dictates another scroll. Then he starts saying, here's what I really need to tell you. The Babylonians are coming, and you need to not resist them. So much of what we hear from prophets is you need to fight them, you need to be opposed to them. Jeremiah is saying something which is very unpopular. He's saying you need not to resist them. They are going to win, and you need to not resist the coming Babylonian onslaught. And he's doing this from hiding, but to illustrate the compliance that he is asking for from the Judean people, he makes a yoke for himself like an ox would wear. And he puts it on, and he says, this is the type of compliance that God is suggesting that I put forward to you. Now, this just sounds weird to me. And it sounded weird to the people that were hearing it. They go, here's this prophet who's supposed to be leading us in the right direction. Our enemy is the Babylonian people. They worship other gods. But Jeremiah has literally made a visual aid. He's made a yoke, and he's wearing it around even though he's in hiding, and saying, this is what I mean. This is what you have to do. Trying to reinforce the message that things are going to come in stages. That which looks like the end frequently isn't. And this is a message that is put forward and that I love because I think we all need to hear it at various places in our lives. We encounter things and we go, okay, that's it. It's all over. And it frequently isn't. It's like the almond branch that starts out bare and then gets buds and then gets leaves and then gets flowers and then gets the fruit of the nut. Everything comes in stages, and we as humans tend to go, the Babylonians just conquered our people They put us into exile. That's the end. And what Jeremiah is telling us is that which looks like the end frequently isn't. Now, he's called the weeping prophet, so there's a lot of stuff leading up to that which looks like the end. And Jeremiah suffers for all the times he's telling people, just let all the stages happen. He leaves Jerusalem, tries to leave Jerusalem, to return to his hometown. And he's arrested for desertion. He'd been in hiding, but they find him as he's trying to leave, and they arrest him. He is placed in an abandoned cistern. Now, I know you sort of heard these stories, but then we forget them and everything. So I kept looking up cistern. What is this? And it's a terrible way to die, basically. It's a form of execution. And they find these abandoned wells, and they throw you down into the well, which is filled with mud, and you basically drowned in mud in the well. And it's a form of execution. I know, this is sad, isn't it? These are not happy stories. But Jeremiah tells himself what he's been telling the people of Judah who are undergoing the Babylonian captivity and everything. What looks like the end often isn't. So hang in there. So here he is, drowning in mud in the bottom of this cistern. And then a brand new character who we have not heard or seen before comes into play. Ebed-Melech. 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 He is a Cushite. He's an Ethiopian. And he comes along and finds Jeremiah in this abandoned well. I remember an old episode of Lassie that always used to crack me up, because Timmy is sitting there and Lassie comes running up and is going crazy barking. And Timmy's mother says, "What's going on?" And Timmy says, "Lassie says the kittens fell down the well." And you go, "Really? You now speak canine, speak collie." Okay. But sure enough, Timmy was right. The kittens had fallen down the well. Well, Ebed-Melech is Lassie here and walks by the abandoned well and hears the cries or the moans or the tears of the weeping prophet Jeremiah in the well, and says, "I've got to do something about this." So Ebed-Melech, this Ethiopian who has been nowhere in the story up till now, saves the day, says, "This is not going to be the end. I'm going to rescue him." It also reminded me of, and speaking of the Richmond Theater fire, if you know that story, and I'm sure some of you do, there was a doctor who was in the fire who was throwing people out of the window. But there was a blacksmith, a freed black man from the neighborhood, who came running and caught all the people that were thrown out of the window. And so a miraculous number of people were saved. I think 70 people, 71, died in the Richmond Theater fire. 1/10 of the population was there that night. 1/10 of the Richmond population was there. But the guy who saved so many people was the blacksmith, a freed black man, who caught all the people that the doctor was throwing out of the window. And when you go to Monumental Church today, there is a plaque for this blacksmith there, who was one of the heroes of the Richmond Theater fire. the other thing I have to say about the Richmond Theater fire, because this fascinates me. The Richmond Theater fire, which happened on the day after Christmas, December 26th of 1811, the theater that burned down was extremely famous. It had been built as the Academy Theater, or sometimes the Richmond Theater, as part of a plan that Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin's daughter had been the head of fundraising for it. They had to establish an arts academy in Richmond. And so they built this theater. Virginia ratified the Constitution in this theater. It was extremely historic. And it burned down on December 26th. And then it appeared on the front pages of papers throughout the world, in Paris and London and Rome, because everybody viewed it as the worst urban disaster that had ever happened, because we were exploring what it meant to be urban. And like I say, 1/10 of the population was either at the theater that day or heard the fire and came running. Of the whole population of Richmond, and the governor was one of the ones who was killed. After the Richmond Theater fire, ministers went into the pulpits throughout all of Richmond and said, you see, this is what happens when you bring in these heathen theater artists into our community. This is what happens. And we entered a century of mourning in which theater had a bad name in Richmond because of this theater fire. And then the November Theater, which used to be the Empire Theater, which is where I used to work, opened on Christmas Day, 1911. And it was the last day of the century of mourning against theater activity in Richmond. So it took 100 years for people to say, maybe it's not theater's fault after all. Let's get back to it. And when you hear the story of what looks like the end frequently isn't, imagine all these theater artists who waited for 100 years to be allowed back into existence in Richmond, Virginia, because of the Great Theater Fire. So Ebed-Melech gets rope, pulls Jeremiah out of the cistern, and winds up saving the day. Jeremiah was, there we go. So Jerusalem was then overthrown when people went into the Babylonian exile. Jeremiah is released and entrusted to Gedaliah, who is the son of the guy who was his initial tutor when he was a 12-year-old boy. And he's a prominent leader in the New Jerusalem under Babylonian activity. Now, all this time, Isaiah is prophesying, but he is in Babylon. He is part of the captivity. The number 2 Isaiah. The original Isaiah existed before that. But the number 2 Isaiah is in Babylon, as is Daniel and other prophets, writing about all of this from the perspective of the captives. But Jeremiah is staying with the remnant that remained in Jerusalem during the captivity. He is entrusted to Gedaliah And then Gedaliah is assassinated. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, is captured again, sent to Egypt, and what rabbinical tradition tells us, he is stoned to death by his fellow Judeans. Merry Christmas. So that's the story of Jeremiah, and it is sad in virtually every way, and you can understand why he is called the weeping prophets. But there is another side to the story. Last night, when we went to the gala, it was supposed to be a costume event, and I don't have access to a costume department anymore. And so I just had to pull something that I had. And so I found this Disney shirt that I have. And this is my shirt with all the happy aquatic characters from Little Mermaid. So it has smiling fish and seabirds and crabs, and everybody is very colorful and happy and smiling because they're all in the cast of Little Mermaid and they've got work. So all the animated characters are very happy in this. So last night I decided I would wear this because this was the closest I came to having a costume. And then as I was researching this story yesterday and then getting dressed in this to go to jail, I went, I should wear this tomorrow to deliver my Sunday school lesson. And then I thought the better of it. But the reason why I said, yeah, and as I'm walking in, everybody will look at me and go, what on earth? But the reason why I thought this made a lot of sense has to do with the Three Dog Night song that goes, Jeremiah was a bullfrog. Everybody knows that song, right? It was number one. Interesting thing about that song, it was written by Hoyt Axton, whose mother was also a songwriter, and his mother wrote Heartbreak Hotel. And when Three Dog Night had a number one hit with Joy to the World, which is Jeremiah was a bullfrog, they had a number one hit, and Hoyt Axton became the first. Aren't you a wonderful man? Thank you. See, and you even bought this so I can do this and not get a water stain. You don't know Joy to the World? I mean, Jeremiah was a bullfrog? Jeremiah was a bullfrog, was a good friend of mine. He never had nothing to say, but I enjoyed drinking his wine or something. He sure had mighty fine wine, singing joy to the world. All the boys and girls, now come on, everybody. Joy to the fishes in the deep blue sea. Joy to you and me. All right, so this is my Happy Fishes in the Deep Blue Sea shirt. So I thought I should wear that. And here's the reason why. Hoyt Axton, when he first wrote the song, and I looked this up because I was hoping there was a connection, the original lyrics were, Jeremiah was a prophet, God's truth, right? Was a good friend of mine. And Three Dog Night went, wait a minute, that's too serious. And he said, no, I want him to put aside the cars and the bars of the world and focus on love. And I want the message to be joy to the world, just like it was with Jeremiah the prophet. Now here is the weeping prophet inspiring in Hoyt Axton a gazillion years later. The message, joy to the world. Because Hoyt Axton read the rest of the story. read that part in Jeremiah, I think it's chapter 29, I can't remember, where he says, and after all this capitulation that I am asking for, after you give in to the Babylonians and put up with the captivity, after all that, I am bringing you a new Redeemer, and God is going to return his people to Jerusalem. Hoyt Axton was a folk singer. His other big hit was Greenback Dollar that the Lettermans sang long before Joy to the World. And so when he wrote Jeremiah was a prophet, it's kind of like Paul Simon that I talked about a couple weeks ago when he wrote, the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls, tenement halls. We hear these lyrics and we don't think there's anything biblical in them. But sometimes there is. We hear Jeremiah's prophecies of foreboding gloom through the Babylonian encounter. What do you see, says God? He says, I see a cauldron tilting, towards us. It's tilting away from the north and towards the south. All this boiling water, boiling oil that's going to come and hurt our people. But that's just the beginning. That's not the end. And what we are told by those people who read all of this and say, here's what I want you to come away from Jeremiah with. A vision of, as we've said every Sunday, unstoppable light. That which seems like the end isn't. And in fact, Jeremiah says that God is going to make for us a new way, a new covenant. In Jeremiah 31, this is a covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write it on their hearts. So he's not saying I'm going to write it on a stone tablet, and that stone tablet is going to be put in the Holy of Holies in the temple, which has now been destroyed, and the stone tablets have disappeared. He says, I am going to make a new covenant, and I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Joy to the world, all the boys and girls now. We are meant to read this, and then in Luke, at the Last Supper, Jesus quotes that exact verse. In the same way, after the supper, Jesus took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And I think that's it for me. I'm trying to see if there's any more in the story. So I'm tending to end this one 10 minutes early, but there's a lot that can bore you to death with Jeremiah. And so I'm trying to avoid that. And I want to end on the happy fishes note. And remember, and next week when we go into Ezekiel and Daniel, and then the final week, we'll go into the women prophets. What we are seeing is this continued message of unstoppable light. It is not, you children are bad, I'm going to punish you, and that is the end of the story. The big contributions that Jeremiah makes to our understanding of our faith, and particularly the people of his time, that which looks like the end frequently isn't. And I am establishing a new covenant for all the nations. All the language changes now to all the nations. A new covenant with all the nations, and it will be written on your heart, not written on a tablet that is kept in the Holy of Holies in the temple. So the dependence on the temple is lessened. The dependence on those tablets is lessened. And where the emphasis is put is the covenant has to be written on your heart, and you will know that it is because of the way you treat other people. It's not just about God saying, worship me and me above all others, which has been the standard message up to now. Now it's, and put that into action. Last week we saw Isaiah saying, how do we define power? It's not just military might, but it's through servant leadership. So these messages are piling one on top of the other. Next week we'll talk about Ezekiel, we'll talk about Daniel, but they're leading us, as Christians we believe, to the birth of Jesus. But as Jews will believe, it is leading them towards seeing all the positive messages that God has in store for his people. That's it. Thank you very much. I will see you next week. Huh? It was at Art Space and at another store in Stratford.